Tales of American Political History with Clint Hackney.
There are a few issues that virtually every human society has to tackle. There's education, safety, enforcement of rules. And then there's transportation. Footpaths, wheels, boats, roads, trains, cars, and planes. The needs and desires for people to get from one place to another create problems, debates, and eventually solutions. And it's usually one of the least controversial matters people deal with. In America, we've tended to take big leaps using giant projects in building our transportation infrastructure. There were the trails blazed for the Pony Express and a grand network of rails in the East, followed by building the Lincoln Highway for early automobiles and the interstate highway system built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And if I were going to teach a class on how American democracy works, I'd need only 2 books, both about transportation. The development of our transportation systems in the United States is partially the result of the building of gargantuan visionary projects that provided big leaps in our mobility. In fact, if I were going to teach a class on how American democracy works, I'd need only 2 books, both about transportation projects that were conceived of more than 150 years apart. I-69, The Last Great American Highway, written by Matt Dellinger, and published in 2010, tells the story of the dream of an interstate highway that would start at the Canadian border in Michigan, ending at the Mexican border in Texas. It is still under construction more than 25 years after the idea arose. I've mentioned that I would only need 2 books to do a good job teaching a class on American democracy. The one I mentioned earlier is I-69 by Matt Dellinger. The other, Nothing Like It in the World, The Men Who Built the Transcontinental Railroad, written by Stephen Ambrose, is a detailed account of the vast project of building a railroad in the 1860s that spanned the North American continent. Though the politics of each of these 2 projects are much alike, and both are instructive about American democracy, it's the Transcontinental Railroad that I want to focus on for the remainder of this story. The idea of building a railroad that connected the Atlantic with the Pacific was first published in 1832. Arguments can be made that other visionary projects impacted America's transportation more than the Transcontinental Railroad, but I say bunk. Completion of that rail line from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific was the big daddy of them all. The first written proposal to build a railroad across the continent was Dr. Hartwell Carver's article in the New York Courier in 1832. Dr. Carver's dream was to come to fruition 37 years later. He made a formal proposal to Congress in 1847, and in 1853 the government began to survey the West for routes, followed by congressional funding and the Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864. Before it ended, there was land speculation, corruption, protest, and political upheaval. It's been described as the greatest physical feat of 19th century America. Built by the Central Pacific Railroad from the west and the Union Pacific from the east, the 2 railroad companies used large workforces of Irish and Chinese immigrants and finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah, May 10, 1869. A ceremonial golden spike was hammered in to join the rail lines together, and the nation was transformed. Some have called it the world's first mass media event because the moment was telegraphed everywhere. But for sure, the railroad brought social and economic changes and had a dramatic change on mobility. Before that last spike was driven, it took half a year to get from the East Coast to the Pacific. The pounding of that spike reduced the time to 1 week.